Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Alexander Thompson and the murder of Mary Jane Irving, known as Annie, which took place in the Elswick area of Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1898. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add that I always do these days, that I do record these stories live, so do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. There is very little information about the backstory of either Annie or Alexander, so the details will be quite basic. Alexander Thompson was said to be around 37 years old in 1898, so would have been born in around 1861. His place of birth and parents are unknown, and he was one of at least 4 children. Alexander was married with at least one daughter, and he worked as a labourer at the Elswick works in Newcastle, and he had previously been in the army. He was described by neighbours as being a quiet and steady man. Annie, the victim, was said to be around 26 years old at the time of her death, so would have been born in around 1872. Her parents are unknown, but it was known that her father was dead and that she was one of at least 10 children. She had moved to Newcastle from Scotland in around 1896 and taken a job as a waitress in Scotswood Road. She had lodged for a time in Gateshead, but had recently moved to Cannon Street in Newcastle, where she lodged with Alexander Thompson, his wife and daughter. Annie had become friends with the young daughter and would often go out with her and her mother when they went to the markets on a Saturday. On March the 19th, 1898, Mrs. Thompson and her daughter were going to the local markets in Newcastle, and they asked Annie if she would like to join them, as she often did. However, this day she decided she did not want to go. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter, neither of whom were ever named, left Annie in the kitchen of the home at around 3 p.m, sitting next to the fire. Alexander Thompson had also gone out, and he had left around 45 minutes prior to his wife and daughter. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter returned to their home in Cannon Street at around 5:45 p.m, and on opening their front door, they found the body of Annie lying in the passage. She had been severely beaten and was, they believed, dead at the time. Mrs. Thompson ran back out into the street screaming, and a neighbour came to ask what was wrong. He was shown the body, and he immediately went in search of a policeman and a doctor. When the police arrived, they noted that Annie had possibly tried to escape from the house, as both the front and back doors had large quantities of blood on them, and they also felt that she had been pushed or thrown into the fire at some point, as one of her arms was quite badly burnt. Dr. Baumgartner was sent for, and he knew immediately that Annie was dead. He felt the wounds had been inflicted by a coal rake that had been found lying on the floor beside her body. And after he had examined Annie, she was removed to the mortuary, which still at the time was known as the Dead House. It seemed at first that none of the neighbours had seen or heard anything other than the neighbour who lived in the flat above, who said she had heard screams but did not think much of them. She also heard the door close a few moments later, but did not look out of her window to see who it was. And there were no signs of a break-in, and it was felt by the police that the person who had committed the crime either lived in the home or had been allowed to enter by Annie herself. Later that day, a witness came forward and stated that she had seen Alexander in the area of the house around the time the crime had been committed, and on the same night, the police arrested Alexander Thompson on suspicion of the murder of Annie Irving. Blood was found on many areas of his clothing, and he was later formally charged with the willful murder of Annie Irving. The inquest was not fully covered, so I'll be using details from that along with the police court appearance for the next part of the story. The inquest was opened at the mortuary in Newcastle before Coroner Hoyle. Joseph Irving said he had identified the body as being that of his sister, Mary Jane Irving, known more commonly as Annie. He said she was 26 years old and had moved to Newcastle from Scotland around 2 years previously. It was stated that Alexander had left his home at around 2 p.m. and had gone to meet two friends in the Dean Hotel in Newcastle. He was in their company until just after 4 p.m. when they noticed he was no longer in the pub. The men, who were not named, were unable to confirm how long he was absent for. An unnamed grocery delivery boy said he had called at the house in Cannon Street at around 4 p.m. on the afternoon of the murder. He stated that Annie had answered the door and taken in the parcel. She was perfectly fine at this time. Henry Carr said he was a machine man at the Elswick works and he knew Alexander and his family quite well. He said he had been near their home on the day in question when Mrs. Thompson had been in the street screaming, and on going to see what was wrong, he said she told him of the body of a young girl in the passage of the house. He had gone inside and noticed lots of blood and the poor girl lying on the floor. He was not certain if she was dead at this point, so he had immediately went to fetch the police and a doctor. He said it was not until some time later that he had found out that she had already been dead when he first saw her body. Mary Claydon said that she lived in Cannon Street in Newcastle and her home was above that of the Thompson family. She said on the day of the murder she was at home around 4:30 p.m. bathing her children when she heard some quite loud screams. When asked, she said she thought they sounded to be coming from the rooms below, and she believed that the screams were from a woman. She did not think anything of it. In fact, she believed it could have been Mrs. Thompson disciplining her daughter. Shortly after this, she said she heard the downstairs front door bang loudly, but she did not look out of her window to see who had left the house. Isabella Jones said that she lived at 9 Cannon Street in Newcastle, and she stated that she had seen Alexander entering his home sometime between 4 and 5 p.m. on the day in question. When asked, she said she was certain it was between these times, but was unable to give an exact time. Alexander at this point interrupted the witness to suggest that it had been much earlier when she had seen him, but Isabella said she was certain it had been between 4 and 5 p.m. and not any earlier. Superintendent Finlay said that acting on information received that Alexander had been seen entering the house at the time the crime had been committed, he had gone in search of him around several public houses in Newcastle. He said he had been found at around 8:30 p.m, somewhat the worse for drink. And when told what he was being arrested for, he said that Alexander had replied, saying, "If I am charged with it, I cannot help it, I will have to stand by it." Alexander interrupted at this point and said that it was all false. Superintendent Finlay said due to the prisoner's drunken condition, he could not be formally charged until some time later. And when asked, he said that the clothing belonging to Alexander had all been bloodstained, including a new shirt that the prisoner had only worn once previously, so there were no other obvious reasons why this would have been bloodstained other than Alexander being the person who had committed the crime. Dr. Baumgartner stated that he had performed the post-mortem on the body of Annie Irving, and he believed that she had died due to blood loss from the severe wounds to her head and body, and he believed that these had been caused by a coal rake which had been found close to the body and was also covered with blood and hair from the victim, and he also stated that Annie had been abused. Neither Mrs. Thompson or her daughter gave any evidence at the inquest. The coroner then stated that the jury would be aware that this was a very serious case with very serious consequences, and it was for them to decide if there was enough evidence to find the prisoner guilty of willful murder. The jury retired for only a very short time before returning a verdict of guilty of willful murder against Alexander Thompson, and he was committed for trial and taken to Newcastle prison. At the end of the proceedings, his wife and daughter both burst into tears, and his wife cried out, "Oh, Alex, say you didn't do that thing." And Alexander replied, "No, I did not do it." I did not find any details of a funeral for Annie Irving. However, it is possible that her family would have taken her body back to Scotland. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Annie either in Newcastle or in Scotland. At this point, we would normally move on to the trial. However, there would be no trial in this case. Alexander had been placed in what was known as an observation cell at Newcastle Prison, where the warders could see him when they were passing the cell at any point in time. And at midnight on Friday, April the 8th, around 1 week after the inquest, a warder noticed something was very wrong in Alexander's cell. On raising the alarm and entering the cell, it was found that Alexander had taken his own life. Efforts were made to revive him, but they were unsuccessful. He had left a letter for his wife, details of which were not given, stating that he was innocent of the crime, but that he did not plan to be around to go to trial. An inquest was held shortly after this, and the jury reached the verdict of death by strangulation. The funeral of Alexander Thompson took place on April 12, 1898 at Elswick Cemetery, and it was said to be a very private affair with only around 20 people present, including 3 of Alexander's brothers and his daughter. However, it does not seem that his wife was present. As expected, I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Alexander. After his death, it was stated in the local newspapers that the police believed he may have been responsible for 2 earlier murders that had taken place in Newcastle, both of young women. In one case, it was stated that Alexander had actually been under observation by the police at the time, as he had been the last person seen with the girl before her death, but there had not been enough evidence to charge him at the time. And since his arrest for the murder of Annie Irving, some new witnesses had come forward, stating that they were certain that Alexander had been the last person seen with both of the women before their deaths from the previous murders. And Mr. Clark, who would have been the prosecutor in the case of Annie Irving, said that he believed had Alexander lived, he would have been facing a trial for 3 murders instead of 1. I did not find any details of what happened to Alexander's wife and daughter after his death. This was a very tragic case, and while I cannot say that I am certain Alexander was guilty of the 2 previous murders, as there was no evidence or details or anything to go on to see whether he was truly linked to those crimes, I do feel that he was responsible for the death of Annie Irving. Despite writing to his wife to protest his innocence, he did not seem to think that the trial would have proved him innocent, and he obviously did not want to face this trial and the possible chance of being hanged for the crime. The evidence, although there was not a massive amount, all seemed to point to his guilt. He was seen entering the house around the time of the crime, and he confessed in some small part to the crime when first arrested, and his clothing was all blood-stained with no obvious other reason for the stains to be there. It, however, does not seem to have been a premeditated crime. It is possible that he returned to the home for some other reason, and on finding Annie home alone, he, in his drunken state, made advances to her which were not welcomed, and a struggle between the two resulted in him losing control and attacking and killing her. But what do you think? Was Alexander guilty of the murder of Annie? Did he somehow prove his guilt by taking his own life? Or do you think it was possible that someone else committed the crime, and the evidence of one person saying they had seen him in the area sealed his fate? And do you think it was possible that he had been guilty of the 2 previous crimes? Or do you think that they were possibly a case of mistaken identity? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting. It is, as you may have noticed, a lot shorter story this week than normal. I do still have a lot of family issues that are going on, and I did actually look for something that was a little shorter this week to give me a little bit more time to be able to write and record, etc. But I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.